just the football players. Hey, Courtney.
Good morning, everybody. And it is now September the 8th. So we are at least almost the second week of September completely. And we left off on page 400, right at the conclusion of Romans. And then we'll go do the conclusion. We'll do a little bit of the outline, and we'll be able to start the next book. So in the closing, now we're talking chapters 15 and 16 in the closing chapters. So in the closing section, Paul shared some of his personal plans with the Roman leaders. He intended to make a missionary trip to Spain and would pass through Rome as he traveled westward. We see that in 23 to 29. He welcomed their assistance in completing the projected journey to Spain. So just like now, where churches support missionaries, either cooperatively as a larger group donating or individually supporting individual missionaries, then Paul is asking and counting on their support to him to help finance the trip he's making to Spain to reach the lost there. Phoebe for her service in the church, and probably committed this letter to her for delivery, and that's in 1 to 2. So we have probably, because it doesn't explicitly state it. After singling out Phoebe for praise, he sent personal greetings to a large number of friends and acquaintances in Rome, and we see that in the first part of chapter 16. Now he's ending it, and the problem with a missionary who starts churches, stays there maybe a couple of years, and then moves on to start another church is once you leave, you're relying on the church to maintain sound doctrine, to disciple and teach each other, and to also know good doctrine from bad doctrine. Because if you don't know good doctrine from bad doctrine, you won't know how to choose and avoid bad doctrine. So here, he warned against false teachers in 17 to 20, and greetings from his fellow Christians with him in Corinth. So he does take a moment to warn them against false teachers that arise both within the church and outside of the church, and that's always been a problem, where if you don't know what the Bible says, then you don't know sound doctrine to guard against bad doctrine. And he concluded with the doxology, praising the plan of salvation and the wisdom of God. So here on bottom of 400, we start, a general outline of what occurs within the book of Romans and what verses it occurs in. So when we go to page 402, for further discussion, if you circle number 3 and then underline justification, redemption, and propitiation. So those are 3 New Testament words that you should be aware of. You should know what they mean. And that is also important because as a Christian, if someone asks you, well, what does propitiation mean? Because right here it is in this verse, and it deals with salvation, and you're like, I don't know. Then your own Bible study needs to be such that it equips you to answer questions that are not speculative or doctrine that's not covered. It is a vocabulary word that would exist right in the New Testament in the context of justification and redemption. So that's why I say underline those 3 words, and you should be able to know what those 3 words mean. So next, we're starting with the letters, the Corinthian letters. So always what we do, and here's what we'll see. We'll talk about the city of Corinth, so we have an idea about its background and the problems there. We'll talk about authorship, the founding of the church in Corinth, Paul's relationship with the Corinthian church, and finally, this one has a great chronology of Paul's relationship with the Corinthian church that spans several books, the nature of the opponents, and then at that point, we're going to be able to actually start into the message. So, the Corinthian letters. The city of Corinth was located on a narrow strip of land called an isthmus that connected the Peloponnesian Peninsula with northern Greece. It had two separate seaports, Cenchrea on the Aegean Sea on the east, and I'm going to mess this up, Lycium on the edge of the Gulf of Corinth in the west. So Cindy and I were fortunate. What they've done several centuries later, they dug a canal. And I mean, it's an impressive one because of the rise in elevation. And so it's not like a canal where you just had to make it deep enough for smaller boats and then you were okay. This, you had to cut all the way through the rock to get to sea level, and then you had to dig it out. So in the same idea of it was shorter to go in the biblical times to the seaport, truck it across land and go to the other protected seaport, then you could go on to Rome. Rather than if you made the big stretch all the way around the perimeter, then it had rough seas. There were always issues. There were dangers. So that's why later in time they dug that canal to allow shipping. And now it's not really used because when they dug it, nobody had ever thought ships would grow that big. And so now some pleasure ships go through it and some other smaller ships. But it's really, if you ever look it up, it's amazing that what can be done. So, but that was to show even now, or even when the canal was dug, that was still a major seaport. The city's location made it a crossroads for travel and commerce and contributed to its prosperity. And so ship captains eager to avoid the stormy dangers of sailing around the Peloponnesian Straits in the south would dock at one port in Corinth. Like I said, the cargo was unloaded, hauled overland, and loaded onto another vessel on the opposite side. So they avoided the risk of losing the ships, the lives, and the dangerous voyage. So if you were Corinth, then that natural small area, that isthmus between the two land masses, and all the trade, then you would be a city that would grow. And you would have lots of commerce, and you would also have lots of ideas. It would be a very cosmopolitan city with all sorts of different people, different backgrounds, all being there. Corinth was also known for hosting athletic events known as the Isthmian Games. The events took place every 2 years and provided great financial rewards for the victors. Huge crowds thronged to the city for the festivals. So anytime you're having festivals, even today we have festivals. One of my favorite places to go for festivals was Leavenworth, Washington. And they turned the whole town into a little German Bavarian village. And then they had every real and made up festival you could ever think of, because the whole point of having a festival is to get people to come, right? So even Panama City has all sorts of festivals throughout the summer. They have Thunder Week, they have Jeep Week, they have all of these other weeks with the idea of getting people to come. And what do you want the people to do when they come? Yes, thank you. So, so these every 2 years, huge crowds, festivals. So people would know Corinth, and was a reason to go there, not only for the games and the festivals, but because of the commerce. So Rome destroyed Corinth in 146 BC. So the Romans were very forward in their statements to cities that they were attacking. It's either surrender or be destroyed. And so you'd better, really consider what will happen. So Corinth was destroyed in 146, but a century later, it was rebuilt on the same location because it's good for trade. The city developed rapidly as a Roman colony, and its population in the New Testament period was estimated to be as much as 500,000. And so it's hard to have a 500,000 person city. I mean, just to do that is all the infrastructure. So if you go down to Panama City and they're building Margaritaville as a, I mean, I saw them putting in these giant pipes for water, electricity, stoplights, a 4-lane road, all of that, when whatever sewer system they're using. And then on the other side of the bridge in Panama City, now there is an exclusive gated community that's also being built. And so we kind of take infrastructure for granted unless you have your property taxes raised, right? Then you don't take it for granted as much, and you're like, why don't the new people pay for this? But if you look at a city in the time of Christ that had 500,000 people, then it had to be a very organized city, because just simple things like, how do I get water? Do we have a spring? Do we have aqueducts? Rome has wonderful aqueducts everywhere. They were able to move water to where the people were over great distances. They had sewage systems that took sewage and waste away from people to get rid of it. So Corinth was a great place to go on a missionary trip, in the sense that it was big, right? So being big lets you, there'll be some Jews there, there'll be hopefully people willing to hear the gospel message. So in the New Testament period, Corinth was also a capital of the Roman province of Achaia. In ancient times, the city of Corinth had a temple dedicated to the goddess Aphrodite, and it was located at the Acrocorinth, a massive outcropping of rock jutting upward about 1,800 feet above Corinth. So, of course, if you're going to build a big old temple, you're going to want it to be prominent. You're going to build it so everyone would see it. And if you have an outcropping that's 1,800 feet high, that's where they chose. And so ancient writers indicated that 1,000 sacred prostitutes offered their body in the temple in the service of the goddess Aphrodite. Such immorality attracted to the city many people interested only in lascivious living, but evidence suggests that the temple was in ruins during the New Testament era when Paul visited. Immorality was still prominent in the city, however. So something to think about, and we'll have a statement down below, but this city doesn't sound much different than Sodom and Gomorrah, right? It had all sorts of immoral activity. It had people just doing what they wanted. And so and Corinth had some really names that were associated with it. And so with that, it was on lines with Sodom and Gomorrah. And yet we see Paul choosing to go there and reach the lost, right? So he's not just going to smaller cities. He's not just going to pretty moral cities, right? Let's go to the moral cities before we hit the big immoral cities. Or, so he's not doing that. He is truly following the reach the lost. And so to reach the lost, you have to go to where the lost are. And so Corinth contained a well-deserved reputation for fast, prolific living. Realizing that the costliness and moral turpitude involved in visiting Corinth, the Romans geographer Strabo quoted an ancient proverb about the city: "Not for every man is the voyage to Corinth." So even the Romans are making comments that lasted this long on the moral in Corinth. It was just a we have the Wild West, and you think of brothels and that. This is definitely a very immoral place. And then the next sentence talks about there was even a Greek, the city to coin a Greek verb. And now, if you're so bad we create a verb because of your city, then it's pretty well known. Building a Christian church in this loose, lascivious city would not be an easy task. Immorality, contentiousness, heresy, brutality were all prevalent in the prosperous pagan community. So, if you're picking a spot as a missionary to go to, this you wouldn't think would be like at the top of your list. Let's go to the place where everyone is immoral. Not everyone, absolutely, but the vast majority are immoral. They're having all sorts of behavior. And I think if we go there, we can start a church with people who fear God, right? You might have picked a hardworking farming community. You might have picked, I know there's a Jewish community. We'll go to them first because they already know of God, and we're going to try and let them know the Messiah did come. So that trip to Corinth was it wasn't just a city. It was a pretty well-known immoral city that Paul went to. Yet he goes there with the purpose of founding a church, which he does. So the opening verses of both Corinthian letters identify Paul as the author. Now we're on to authorship. And few have contested the claim. And then some scholars have insisted that various parts of 2 Corinthians may not have been written at the same occasion, but they generally accept it. So we always kind of go through the authorship fairly quickly because it's not contested, and normally you will always have somebody that has some academic question that they want to bring up about the book. So that is a consistent theme throughout the Bible, is somebody has an alternative idea about the authorship. So on 404, founding of the church at Corinth. Paul went to Corinth from Athens on his second missionary journey. We see that in Acts 18. And the other thing, when we go through this, when we make it to 406, the chronology of Paul's relationship with the Corinthian church, that when we get to that page, it is a great Acts, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, into how is Paul's relationship documented with the Corinthians. And so journey. There he met Aquila and Priscilla, who were tent makers like Paul. So we already talked about, if you're going to be a missionary, he's following, excuse me, a pattern that we still have, right? Because he's going to ask them for support. So missionaries are normally bivocational unless they can completely get support. But if they can't completely get support, then they're going to have some type of job that they can do, in addition to the support that they receive from the church that they're talking with about supporting them. So today we talk about, for instance, we're looking for a youth minister, right? We live in a small town, and in this small town, there are just absolutely almost no job opportunities, right? And so the biggest opportunity in our region for consistent work that you would be able to come is teaching, right? A school teacher. So I never thought about how important it is, if for bivocational people, to have a skill that is easily transferable and almost usable anywhere, right? So for Paul, it was tent making, because that was a skill that was needed. There were a lot of agricultural people. If you're going to go out and have to have workers that watch the sheep, or you're traveling, a tent's going to be very handy. The same today, if we're looking, so in trying to say how we can't afford a full-time person to support, so they would have to be bivocational. And so the greatest opportunity, even today, would, for now, is teaching, right? Because wherever you go, there's going to be kids. Wherever there are kids, there are going to be schools. And especially if you're in a smaller, more rural area, then there's usually openings for teachers because people get a higher salary and such, or they want the conveniences of living in a bigger city. So that bivocational is still practiced today. And so Paul was using it on his missionary trips. And so Aquila and Priscilla he's with, they were among the Jews expelled from Rome by Emperor Claudius in Acts 18:2. The couple became strongly involved with Paul and his ministry among the Gentiles. And we see that Acts and in Romans. Each day they made tents together, and each Sabbath presented the gospel in the synagogue. Silas and Timothy assisted with the preaching when they arrived from Macedonia. So the other aspect of a bivocational job is, and it worked out well for this because Priscilla and Aquila both were believers, and they're all making tents. So even today, when you're at work, what do you do with fellow workers? You talk, right? I mean, that just goes with being at work. I don't know if anyone that works anywhere where they're like absolute silence, there's no talking during the day. So for Paul to have two people who when it says they became strongly involved with this ministry, that was an opportunity to one-on-one disciple and teach them that they wouldn't otherwise have had. And so, when we talk about discipleship is a personal investment in somebody else. It is an investment where you're taking time to talk to them and they are taking time to talk with you. And so that being both working together and making tents gave those two people a great opportunity to hear directly from Paul about being a Christian. What does it mean? How do I live being a Christian? What does God expect? And so forth. So that's a little bit about them. So Jewish opposition drove Paul from his synagogue ministry, but he found another location for evangelizing nearby, and we see that in Acts. The resistance to the ministry must have been extremely intense, and Paul received considerable encouragement from a divine vision in Acts 18. Paul remained in Corinth for 18 months, but near the end of his period, Jewish opponents brought him before Gallio, the Roman proconsulate of Achaia. So really, when we send a missionary somewhere, we normally talk a decade, right? I mean, to be effective, to get the church where it's autonomous needs time. It needs time because all the people you're trying to reach are working. And if you're bivocational, you're working. And then the only opportunity you have is on the weekends. And so then if we have church like here, then we have 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the evening, but it's not just a sermon, and it's not just teaching. What do we do? What else? We have praise and worship. We have, so that time that is available to us is broken up into segments. And so for him to only be there 18 months is actually a very short amount of time, because the goal of creating a church is that the church becomes autonomous, and that the person who created the church, not created in that sense, but was the founder that was reaching people with the gospel, they're trying to work themselves out of a job so they can go somewhere else. Because the problem that will occur if a church can't become autonomous, what will happen when that missionary leaves or dies? Right, because they're not leading it on their own. Absolutely right. That the church itself will cease once the person that was sent either leaves or dies. And so it's very important, and that's the model is churches have to become autonomous, because if the church is continuously being supported external to them and they don't become autonomous where they support themselves, then as soon as the missionary leaves, the support dries up, the money dries up, the people just dry up. And so 18 months, it might sound like a long time, but it's really not a lot of time to try and establish a church. But and then we see he was brought to, once again, he was brought to the proconsul. So that speaks well of Paul in the fact that people are hearing the message, and there's enough people who have heard about the message or heard the message that they're now trying to silence Paul, and that's why they brought him to the Roman proconsul, is to try and make him leave or be quiet. But he's teaching things that we don't like. Now, especially if you go to a hugely immoral place, right? Now, those are the Jewish opponents. The other people might just turn a deaf ear, right? If you talk about sin, if you talk about moral behavior, if you talk about there is someone other than you that sets the standard of what is right and wrong, right? That's a big touchy point with people, because people want to believe that I set my own standards, right? And then I live according to those standards. Well, you can, but Christianity is saying God sets the standards, and then you have a responsibility and you'll be judged according to what God has expected. Gallio characterized the Jewish opposition to Paul as an internal matter to be settled by the Jews. So when he did that, that was a big plus for Paul. He cleared Paul any wrongdoing before Roman law. The decision of Gallio gave Paul freedom to continue his ministry for some time. We see that in Acts. So if you go and complain to the government, and the government says he's not breaking any laws, then, Paul walks out of court. He's like, I'm not breaking any laws. And so the opposition still might not like it, of course. That wouldn't make them change their mind. But now they've exhausted a legal recourse to try and make Paul move on. So that was a huge benefit for Paul. And it was a huge benefit for the church, because if Paul is discipling and raising up a church, had they said that that is against Rome, then the church, the followers, everything that's being preached would have carried on and would have been against Roman rule too, right? So that would have made it harder for those who are going to church, for everyone. But that saying that this was an internal matter, not for Rome, then it gave him a lot of leeway, and it reduced the threat of being arrested. So now for the last paragraph, I put over the side a normal church, right? Because a lot of times we ask, what is a normal church? Who makes up a normal church? That's because if we look on TV, TV being a source of information, or if we look on the internet, if you look up churches, one thing you'll see are mega churches, right? Huge mega churches. And you'll see a lot of affluent people. And you'll see, you see all these things. So over time, you can wonder, is my church normal? What is a normal church? And a normal church is made up of people, right? So there is some variation on our normal and someone else's normal, right? Because of the economy, the economic area we live in. In Peru, their normal is far different from our normal, right? For the missionary where we're supporting. And so in that church, for them to look at us, I think we would turn into that affluent church, right? And so it does matter where you're at economically when you look at it. But here, the current Corinthian church did not have many members who were locally prominent, wealthy, or otherwise influential. And we see that in 1 Corinthians 1:26. So that's why I'm saying this is just the normal church that he's working with. These are the people who he's dealing with. They weren't the prominent, the wealthy, or the otherwise influential. They were just like normal people, like us. People who have a job, people who have a house, people who are trying to get by, people who are, worried about the normal things in life. So and I'm going to mess this up, Sosthenes in Acts 18 and 1 Corinthians, and Erastus in Romans, were the likely exceptions. So just like any church, a church is made up of people. And so you should have a representation in your church of everybody, right? If there's wealthy, they should be a church. If there's poor, they should be a church. There should be a little bit of everybody. Most Corinthians believers came from degrading backgrounds, and we see that in 1 Corinthians 6, 9 to 11, but they experienced the transforming power of the gospel. So the thing to think about with backgrounds, everyone has one. And sometimes we like to think about backgrounds with the sliding scale of sin, right? We're like, we all have a background, but I was pretty good. So I am in a pretty good spot, right? And then we have people I never thought would get saved, right? They're like way up here and they needed a lot of saving. So, but the reality is, it is not like that. It is everyone was lost. And so the idea that I'm not this, or I'm not a mass murderer, and then in hell, you're right there with mass murderers, right? And you're like, I thought that they would get worse, right? But it's not the case. You were either, I saw a thing on the Titanic, I posted it years ago, and it said, there were rich, there were stewards, there were people shoveling coal, there were all these people on the Titanic, right? And some of them lived in staterooms, they were wealthy, they had everything. Some of them had literally nothing. But when the Titanic lists, there were only two lists: those who were saved and those who were lost. So for us, I like that analogy. That's how it will be. We kind of subdivide ourselves, and we're like, I'm at the promenade deck. I don't even go below the promenade deck because those other people, or I don't know, whatever's up with those people. We have the people shoveling coal to keep the ship going. They don't get, they're like, you have used your one trip to see the outside this week. You'll have to wait till next week to go up and get a brush of breath air again. But all those people were on there, right? They were being served on fine china, all different people. But in the end, there were two lists. You were either saved or you were lost. And so that background that we're talking about with people, we have, everyone that received the gospel and accepted left their background and started over on day one as saved. And so they all had, they did this. This is what we all do. They experienced the transforming power of the gospel. So being saved, yes, everyone has a background, but your background doesn't define you. It is your salvation that changed everything. That is day one of life, being reborn. When that day one happened, everything else in life is gone. It's all forgiven, right? Completely done, forgiven. So we need to remember that is the message that we're bringing, that who you are is not important compared to who you can be. And who you are is lost, and who you can be is saved. So in making that transition by accepting Christ, everything about your past is done. It's over. We don't live in regret. We don't have, we don't have to have all of that. We're forgiven completely. So that's why that transforming power of the gospel. So notes, now here's Paul's relationship with the Corinthian church. Notes and suggestions from the Corinthian letters allows us to piece together the story of Paul's relationship with the church. Now I understand this whole next sentence. Since Paul did not provide us with a detailed explanation of the relationship, our suggested outline must be regarded as tentative, right? Because we say the Bible tells us what we need to know. The Bible doesn't tell us everything we want to know. And Paul in the New Testament is reaching the lost, building churches, talking about how do we live out a Christian life? How do we act at church? How do we forgive? All these things. But the story in Paul's writing is not about Paul. That's why there's these gaps. Because it's not about Paul, right? Paul was just the bearer of the news. The story is always the gospel. It is the news that is reaching the lost. So New Testament scholars have generally accepted this outline with some variations. So now we're going to see a little bit about this an outline. And like I said, we're not going to make it today, but on page 406, this is a really good outline of this and the verses that support it on Paul's trip. So after Paul's 18-month mission to Corinth, he returned to Antioch, and we see that in Acts 18:23, and he began his third missionary journey. During this journey, he remained in Ephesus for approximately 3 years, and we see it in Acts. This period probably parallels the time of Apollos' ministry in the city of Corinth, mentioned in Acts. When problems arose in the church, some Corinthian friends contacted Paul as a founder of the church. So here's something to think about with church problems, right? So first, what is the goal? What are we trying to do with a church problem? Say again? Okay, yes, we want to solve it. We want it resolved, right? So if you start with, we have a problem and we need it resolved. And obviously at this point, are we going to come to agreement ourselves and resolve it? Here, no, right? So the next thing to do, which is hard, is we need to ask somebody, right? And part of asking somebody to resolve it goes back to, are you willing to accept what he says, right? Because if it's just who can we find that will agree with us, right? There's two factions within the church, and we're like, I know Paul agrees with us. Let's contact him, right? Or I know somebody that, whatever their name is, and he agrees with us that if we haven't come, we don't have to change at all. The other people have to change if they're willing, right? So for them to go outside of their own church shows that they are wanting to resolve the disagreement. They're wanting to remain a church, because what happens a lot of times when churches have something and you're like, it says it right here. That's what they're asking Paul. How should we do this, right? And Paul doesn't just go, well, I think if it were me. No, he goes back to, this is what God expects. So you're right, though. If at that point there's a willingness to split, we will walk away from being a big united body, and we're going to make two struggling ones. So think about that when we get these letters or these concerns that come to Paul. This is from a group of people who want the problem resolved, and they want to stay in the body of Christ, and they want it resolved based on, what does God expect, not what do I expect? Because whatever the word is, and that's what when we read the New Testament today, something to think about. The New Testament confronts you all the time. Every time you read it, you should have a point in it where you're like, oh, I knew I was doing that. I don't like to do it. I'm sinful, but I can see that, yes, I should be doing it. And then you're like, okay, I feel a little better. Or you have the opposite. You're like, oh, how did I stumble on this? I really don't like this whole section of the book, because it's telling me what I'm doing it wrong. So the same thing that Paul is going to write to them and say, this is what God expects when we read the New Testament. It's up to us to change, right? If we don't like what it says, that's probably okay too, because you're struggling to live for Christ. And in that struggle, you're going to have to cease living like everyone else. And when we were saved, all of those old thoughts and the old desires just didn't go away overnight. That's why it is a struggle. We have to work on it. And reading the New Testament, we're able to see, oh, I'm not doing that quite right. And it's addressed right here. So the only option at that point is I must change. The Bible doesn't change. The Bible is telling us the expectation. It's up to us to change. So that's a good thing that they were willing to go to Paul. They were wanting to know, what does he say? So Chloe's servants brought him word about disagreements in the fellowship. Others in the church sent Paul a letter requesting information about several issues of behavior and doctrine. And you see in 1 Corinthians, you see a whole list of different verses. It is possible, but not certain, that the three men mentioned in 1 Corinthians 16-17 carried the letter to Paul. So once again, it doesn't say it, but it's quite possible. The report from Cleo's servants and the letter from friends prompted Paul to write 1 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians, Paul promised a forthcoming visit, which he hoped to make after visiting Macedonia. In 1 Corinthians 5:9, Paul referred to an earlier letter to Corinth in which he warned the church against association with immoral people. His earlier letter had caused some misunderstanding, and Paul now clarified his statements. The letter mentioned in 1 Corinthians 5:9 no longer exists. So we don't have the content of it, but we know a little bit about it. So here's the thing about associating, right? Because if we can't associate with the immoral, we'll not use the word associate. So we are trying to reach the lost. And at the same time, we are trying to guard against our own lives, right? So we want to witness to the lost. We want to associate with the saved. The saved are going to build us up. They're going to hold us accountable. That was a big one, right? We want people to hold us accountable. So we want to be associating with believers, and that's what we're doing, right? We have fellowship dinners. We have this. We're associating with us because we need to be built up. We need somebody to tell us what we're going through isn't unique, right? That was like one of the, after when I left military, and because I was old by military standards, so I didn't have a lot of people that were peers. And then I got to my new job, and then I discovered all the things that nobody else was experiencing with their grown kids at work. They were, and so all of a sudden I wasn't special, right? And sometimes not being special is very relieving. You're like, oh, okay, so you have these problems too? Yes, okay, but what do you do? And they're like, there's nothing you can do. You're stuck. Kids are grown. But yeah, I tried grounding them, but yeah, but no, that was, it was good to be able to see other people have problems. And it is also good to see that other people can tell you, I have the same problem, and you're not really going to solve it. You have to pray about it. You have to wait on God, but you can't ground them. You can't send them to their room. You're talking about, family members. You're very limited. So it was very good to hear that. And so that's what I'm saying here with us. Each of us have our own struggles in our daily walk. And each of us, if we don't share what a problem is and have somebody that we associate with that are saved, then we feel like I must be abandoned by God because I'm the only one with this problem. And what we forget is free will. God gave everyone free will. Those people that aren't doing free will very good, they're still impacting me. And so they still get free will. I really don't have a lot I can do, but it was good if, as a group, to come, with the people you associate with that are Christians, and you can be honest with them and say, oh my gosh, this is happening. And they're like, join the club, come over here. We've all experienced it. You're not alone. And it really is uplifting to know that. So that is why there was some misconception on that letter. The only way to reach the lost is to witness to the lost, right? So he wasn't saying don't associate, don't witness to the lost, don't go there. But we do need to also guard our own lives, right? As a congregation, as a who keeps me accountable? Who can I turn to who will come to me? That's the biggie. Because a lot of times you're not going to turn to anybody. You need somebody to come to you and go, hey, what's going on? You're not doing that. You seem like this, you're whatever. So that when we have that, he clarified some misunderstanding. That is great. If we had that is what we want. We want to talk to somebody who knows the word and say, I heard you say this, but how do I live that? What does that mean? How do I reach the lost if I can't go to the lost? And so those are really some good things that occur in the book. Now we are stopping with Paul sent Timothy to Corinth. We're going to stop right there. And next week we will for sure get to turn the page and make it to 406. And 406 is great because it gives a good ongoing chronology of what happens. And David, if I can have you close us.
Dear Lord, thank you for allowing us to be in your house this morning, study and to see how you were leading Paul as he was being a missionary and was going out and starting churches, and how churches are to interact with each other. Pray that you will help us as a church to reach out into our community and to help it to grow and to understand more about you. Pray that you will be with us this morning as we go into worship service. Pray that you be with Brother John as he is prepared to bring the message that you have given to the world. I pray that you will lead and guide in all the service this morning, the worship part, for the supper part. Pray that you be with us as we partake of it. All these things